Welcome to the Cure PDX podcast, where we share insights, methods, and strategies for a less polarized, less violent, and more humane world. I'm your host, Ryan Akade. Today I'm talking to Katherine Keneally. Katherine is a senior research manager at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, or ISD, where she supports projects tracking the intersection of disinformation, hate, extremism, and political violence in the US. Mis, dis, and malinformation, colloquially known as fake news, pose huge threats to society by instigating discord, distrust, and breakdowns in our ability to collectively make sense of the complex world that we live in. So here, Katherine and I discuss the work of ISD, online monitoring of extremism, salient trends and themes in extremist groups, how everyday polarization impacts the rise of extremism, the importance of dialogue, disengagement versus de-radicalization, and then we do a deep dive into the complex topic of dis and misinformation, thinking in bets and how to nuance factual claims, institutional trust, false narratives and other forms of misleading information, social media improvements, and the importance of engaging communities at the local level. Hope you enjoy the show. All right, I am here with Katherine Keneally. Katherine, thanks so much for joining the podcast today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Great. Well, I'm really excited to have you on here. We've known each other for about a year and have worked in various settings and have always been really fascinated by your work at Institute for Strategic Dialogue. So to start, just tell us a little bit about what ISD is and what you guys do.
Sure. So ISD is a global nonprofit that's often looked at as a think tank that is essentially working to counter the threat of extremism worldwide. Over the last couple of decades, we've seen the increase of extremism, not just in the US, but globally. And ISD essentially conducts research and engages in promoting various policies and action programs to help stem the rising tide of extremism.
Great. And this is just a little kind of pedantic point. Do you guys have a working definition of extremism that you use at ISD?
That is a great question. I am not quite sure on that. I think we have, in the research field, sort of come to an agreement on what extremism is. For me, that is the promotion of violence and other potentially violent activities meant to promote a particular ideology or belief system.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I think that's pretty similar to the one I use, which is from a scholar named J.M. Berger, which is basically an ideological group that uses hostile action against opposing groups to fulfill its political goals and also to defend its own identity as a group. That your identity as a group cannot be separated from attacking the outgroup. So,
Yes, absolutely.
yeah.
J.M. Berger is very much used in this field.
Yes, totally. And so say a little bit more about your role at ISD.
Sure. So at ISD, my official title is Senior Research Manager, and I lead much of our work related to political violence. So we are primarily looking at what is happening online across the extremist spectrum, from mainstream platforms like your Facebook and Instagram and TikTok to lesser known platforms are known as your fringe ones like Telegram or Gab or Truth Social. And what we look at and what my primary role is to look at this information and see how it's translating to offline activity, frequently violence. So how are false narratives and conspiracy theories used to push offline action? Recently, much of that's been focused on threats to LGBTQ plus communities and Jewish communities and elected officials. So we try and better understand how the online landscape is influencing real world activities.
Gotcha. So let's dive right into that. So I'm wondering if you can give us a kind of a high level overview of general themes, salient topics, narrative patterns that you're picking up and detecting. I'd like to cover both kind of like far left and far right if you want to do that, and just
Sure.
what are the specific narratives or posts on social media, on these fringe social media sites, that you feel like tend to more often bleed into real world activity or action?
Sure. So there are a few narratives that we've seen popping up in the last year that have influenced real world action. I'll start with the far right or far right extremists. The dominant narratives have largely been around Jewish communities as well as LGBTQ plus communities. With Jewish communities, we've seen the mainstreaming of hate targeting them. There are a number of conspiracy theories that allege that there's some Jewish elite that's controlling everything in the world, everything from your media to government to banks and really everything in between. And we've really seen a mainstreaming of this narrative. And how this has translated into offline activity, we have seen banner drops featuring this language that's meant to intimidate the community by extremist groups. We have seen an increase in swattings targeting Jewish religious institutions such as synagogues and schools. And for those who might not know, swattings are when someone calls law enforcement alleging that there is an emergency at a location. For example, someone's claiming that they are going to harm someone or themselves, and often resulting in a SWAT team's presence. And that's why it's called swatting. We've seen an increase in those really in the last few months. So there is no doubt that the Jewish community is being targeted as a result of these narratives online. Targeting LGBTQ plus communities, two dominant narratives that we have seen are allegations that they are groomers. So that we've seen this in schools frequently, where teachers who are members of the community or are supposed allies of LGBTQ plus communities are alleging that, or people are alleging that they are essentially grooming children. And we also see allegations that hospitals who provide trans care are trying to purposely harm children by providing them with trans surgery and other sorts of care. So those are the two dominant narratives. And what we've seen is an increase in offline threats to these groups. So in the last year, we've seen extremist groups and individuals unaffiliated with any groups show up to drag queen events, especially those that allow children, such as drag queen story hours. In the last year, we've seen individuals seek hiling outside of libraries where children are present. We've seen extremist groups carrying firearms outside of drag events that have resulted in them being shut down or canceled due to fear for participant safety. Additionally, we've also seen swattings to hospitals or bomb threats to hospitals that has resulted in them having to cease care across the hospital because they are alleged to be providing trans care. So those are definitely the dominant ones that we are seeing as it relates to Jewish communities and LGBTQ plus communities. On the far left, much of it has been focused on what we are seeing related to Cop City. For those that might not be aware, there is a building being built in Georgia that's meant to provide training and just improve the facilities of law enforcement in Georgia. Regardless of, the belief system surrounding this new institution, what we are seeing are some calls for violence targeting law enforcement in reaction to this. So much of it has been focused on law enforcement recently. We have seen some environmental focus. So we've seen some more extreme climate change activity where people are, blocking roadways and gluing themselves to roads. But in most cases, those narratives haven't elicited violence. They've just elicited other sorts of offline activities. So I would argue that those are the dominant narratives that we're seeing.
Gotcha. Thank you. Thank you. So I have kind of another specific question is how do you actually do the monitoring? Like, do you basically make a bunch of fake accounts and scroll? Like, what is that? Like, what is that like?
Fortunately and unfortunately, it's not quite that simple. So our team so we have a team of analysts in the US and abroad who are actually in these spaces online. And again, as I mentioned, across the extremist spectrum, across the various types of social media. So they essentially serve as flies on the wall online. And each analyst is assigned to a particular movement or maybe more than one movement. And they are hyper focused on seeing, what are extremists in those movements saying? What are the trends that we're seeing? Are they promoting specific tactics or new narratives appearing? And they're simply flies on the wall. They're seeing what's happening, but they're not contributing to the environment in any way.
Got it. Got it. And after you have detected concerning trends or narratives, or someone flags something like, hey, this is really concerning in terms of perhaps engendering some real life violent action against a group or something, what is ISD's kind of theory of change or intervention methodology?
Sure. So this is something that we have recently been focusing a lot of or attempting to focus a lot of our efforts on is beyond just monitoring and documenting what's happening, how do we impact real change? One of the things that we have been focused on is social media policy, where it's hard to argue that social media has not played a role in the current state of the extremist threat environment. That can be certain platforms that are promoting or amplifying extremist content to people, especially youth. Might be policies surrounding mis and disinformation related to the election. But essentially, we seek to help push for policy that better promotes a safe social media environment that does not actively promote extremism. Additionally, intervention. So there have been a few programs that have sought to directly intervene in countering radicalization of people in the US and abroad. Those are meant to essentially, help off-ramp people who are already being radicalized, and then just overall prevention. So what beyond social media, what other methods can we help prevent the radicalization of people online? I think at the end of the day, I know that there's this hope that some new organization or idea will pop up and it's going to, eradicate all of the hateful extremist contents on the internet, since everything goes well and extremism ends. But I think what really is necessary to countering the threat of extremism is our local solutions. Every community is different. We all have our own sets of problems. The solutions for a borough in New York City are going to be very different compared to one in, for example, where I live in Montana. The solutions are very different, and it's really going to come down to, working with local communities to counter the threat.
Great. And can you give more examples? I want to get to actually unpack both of those more, but in terms of the local community work, what are some things that you have seen to be successful? What are some things that you guys do? And what are some things you would like to see done more on a local level?
Sure. So we are a global organization, but we do work with other as we talk now, local organizations. So groups that are providing, they might be working directly on counter extremism, but they might also be individual or organizations that are supporting teachers or hospitals or people in the community that are being threatened. So we're predominantly focused on developing those relationships and providing resources that's helpful to local communities. And that also includes local governments. We have a program called SCN that provides information to mayors on countering extremism, to directly help local governments at the community level try and address their needs in their areas, which is, I think, a really, really cool and unique program. So more definitely needs to be done. There are a lot of very large organizations but working with communities, be it counter extremism or other groups that provide even social services. Many people who have engaged in violence or been involved in extremism in the past have needed some sort of social services. So developing those connections, I think, is very important.
Yeah, and this gets into something I think about a lot. It's interesting because I was just in a meeting about a retreat that I'm going to help facilitate this weekend, and there was talk amongst the pastors in the meeting I was in about the importance of energizing kind of the middle and bringing people who can come to the table for better dialogue and discussion for less polarized community, like internally less polarized community. And I'm curious, do you think the rise in political polarization, so not even extremism in terms of like fringe groups doing things, but just the overall climate of polarization in the United States, where the average Americans of different sides are having a harder time speaking about political differences, people are self-sorting into different ideological camps, via states. People are moving away from the West Coast to Florida or Texas or vice versa or something, right? Um, what impact, like causally, do you think the variable of just mainstream political polarization has on extremist recruitment and activity and narrative? Or do you think it is strictly more like a personal psychological socioeconomic phenomena? Do you know what I mean?
Yes, I know exactly what you mean. I think it's both, but it's certainly influencing the environment. So the hyper politicization that we're currently experiencing in the US today has really promoted the us versus them dichotomy, where if you're not Democrat, you must be Republican, and there's nothing else in between. You are the enemy. What do extremists promote? They promote our group is the best, they are the enemy. And the hyper politicization is making it easier for groups to promote their beliefs to people who you would characterize as just being members of the mainstream public. We see extremist groups in the last year try and appeal to the mainstream when it comes to issues of immigration or LGBTQ plus issues that have made their way. They are in the mainstream, policies are being discussed, and they become incredibly hyper politicized. And so when you look at this phenomenon online, you're seeing it happen offline as well, where individuals who are members of extremist groups who are participating in these activities offline, you can see them wearing their extremist garb, carrying firearms in the same on the same street, protesting with a similar narrative as someone who's unaffiliated with any group. And so this hyper politicization is making it easier for them to appeal to quote mainstream audiences.
That makes complete sense. Yeah. And in my experience too, I've noticed that the toxic polarization that's seeped into a lot of communities, both conservative communities and left-leaning communities, that actually directly impacts people's mental health. People get alienated. They had a really bad political disagreement with their community, especially in 2020 was just a horrendous year for polarization. 2016 to 2020, all of the global, COVID and George Floyd and the election, and there's so many communities that's fragmented. And anecdotally, I've talked to people who have been severely traumatized. Like this community, I've been with this church for 35 years, and these were my people. We had a huge fight over politics, and I basically got kicked out or had to leave. And the social alienation and the psychological trauma, like that can't help. You know what I mean? So it's like it directly impacts the more direct causal factors that lead to radicalization to extremism, in my view.
Absolutely. I think that there is nothing really good from putting people in boxes. And the ostracization of particular communities is not going to be helpful. At the end of the day, I think I, I am a little bit hopeful in that while I think things are being hyper politicized, I think communication between people really goes a long way. In many of my presentations that I give or conferences that I go to, I'm pretty astonished that in such a hyper politicized environment, how many people I speak to that are in the middle, who might identify as Republican or Democrat, and then you get to talking to them, and they're really in the middle. And so I'm cautiously optimistic right now. I think we can do it, but it's going to take more communication, bridging the gaps between people, because it's a lot difficult. It's a lot more difficult to hate your neighbor once you've spoken to them, and you can put a face to the name.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. That is actually my background, and I got kind of sucked into the CVE and violence prevention and extremism world. But yeah, that is really my background in mediation and conflict resolution.
Yeah,
So 100%.
yeah, it's just a lot harder once you've spoken to someone. I experience this all the time where I'll get on a plane and I travel a lot and I really want to not get sick. And my seat neighbor will be coughing and I'm very upset. I'm very mad at them that they have gotten on the plane while they're sick. I don't want to talk to them. I don't like them at this point. And then we start having a conversation and we get to know each other. I'm like, oh, guess it's okay. You're sick and now I like you. But once you've spoken to them, it's very hard to not like them or not feel for them. So communication goes a long way.
Absolutely. That is one of our mantras at the Cure PDX project. It's through relationships, it's through building trusted relationships where people can get to know each other in a more complex way that breaks down that boxing tendency that we have, right? Opening to people's uniqueness and holistic fullness of them as a human being. All really important stuff.
Absolutely.
I want to, so there are two kind of concepts I want to geek out about with you. So the first pair is, are you familiar with the whole discourse on like de-radicalization and disengagement and those kind of
Yes.
distinctions? Right. So my understanding with the de-radicalization is people renounce both the extreme group they're affiliated with and the belief system, the ideological perspective that goes with the group. And some people will add that part of de-radicalization is being proactive and like renouncing your past and kind of like atoning for it or making up for it in some way. So it's not only I'm no longer affiliated with a formerly bad group and ideology, but I'm actively kind of pushing back against it now that I've distanced myself from it. And then there's this whole concept of disengagement where people stop group affiliation and hostile activity, as I understand it, but they still might hold some of the beliefs that are kind of radical or kind of problematic. And I'm curious what if ISD has or if you personally have a perspective on kind of the right goals of an intervention, right? So, for example, at Cure PDX, and this is part of Cure Violence Global's motto, right? We're very firm on saying we're not trying to change people's ideology or beliefs, like the content at all. You can even be a part of a group, just don't act violently, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of the first thing. Is just don't act violently. And then that gets into this debate of, but what happens if people hold beliefs which like directly espouse violence, and so there's a direct link, at least apparently there's a link between the beliefs people hold and the actions that they take. And so I had kind of meditated on this and then developed this framework I call transformative dialogue, which is basically not trying to change people's views in terms of the content or the substance of their views, but changing the relationship they have with their views in such a way that it lowers the probability of them acting on it. Right. So I'm just curious, what do you make of this whole conversation and what you think the right intervention should be targeted at?
It's a tough question. And I think if we had a solution, we wouldn't be having this discussion. But I think it's because there is no one size fits all model. When it comes to extremist beliefs, what we often see are situations in their life that have essentially left this gap that often extremism has filled. It could be, lack of access to basic, basic needs or basic services. It could be difficulties in their home life. It could be having experienced some sort of severe trauma. Either they've been abused by their parents or they have lost a loved one. We often see people who have some sort of gap in their lives, and extremism has filled them. So to be able to either, regardless of whether you're talking about disengagements or de-radicalization, anytime you do either, you also need to work to address the reasons that led them to radicalization in the first place. And so I think it's truly dependent upon the person, which is going to work best. I think you aren't going to change the minds of everyone. People will hate particular groups. We can't solve for all of that, but what it comes down to is the violence, who is going to act on it. So I like the transformative dialogue that you mentioned. I think you can't change the minds of everyone. And especially with de-radicalization, it's a lot to ask of someone to, after they've been de-radicalized, to work to counter it, right? Like that is a lot to ask of a person. And it's, it might not necessarily be fair or right for them. It might not, they might not have time for it. They might be busy feeding their families, that they can't be working towards that. So I think it really comes down to the individual level, and that's why I keep on hitting on it: local, local, local.
Absolutely. We need really tailored approaches, right? Because everyone has different life journey, different path, different needs, different unmet needs. And it's really
Yes.
about being able to understand that as clearly as possible and meeting people where they are, right? So
Yes, meeting people where they are, I think, is the perfect descriptor for that.
totally. One of my mantras is I try to talk to people on their own terms, on their own turf.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I imagine that can be a little scary at times, but I mean, you have to create that space for them to feel comfortable to engage with you.
And oftentimes that's on their own turf. So
Yes. Oh,
yes,
most often and always on their own turf. They're not going to come to your house and
exactly.
in your safe space. No, you have to meet them where they are, where they feel most comfortable, and you have to build that trust.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to pivot a little bit and talk about this whole subject of mis, dis, and malinformation. Something that I actually get really excited about. Um, and so maybe just to start, can you just explain what mis, dis, and malinformation is to people and can explain those distinctions?
Sure. So mistis and malinformation, and there are some disagreements on, I think, in the field still a little bit on what technically or counts as each category. So misinformation is information that is false, might have a little bit of truth, but essentially is spread usually online. That's just not true. Disinformation is information that is shared online intentionally, recognizing that it's not true. When we say disinformation, we often think of hostile state actors or nefarious individuals or groups who are pushing specific false narratives for their own personal gain. And then malinformation is what we often just call bad information. There might not be any ill intent. There might be a couple of nuggets in it that are true, but it's just essentially bad information that is shared. So at the end of the day, what I like to just describe it as is false narratives. If we want to put them all in a bucket and talk about, what is really influencing offline activity and violence, it's false narratives is the phrase I often use.
Very interesting. So this is where I really want to kind of dig into this subject because I've experienced so much polarization and pushback around terms like mis and disinformation, false narratives. So I've been doing a lot of kind of philosophical dissection of these concepts and where I feel the blowback comes from. So I thought about this before this podcast and basically broke it down to three different questions. So I kind of want to go through each one with you. So the first question I have is, how do we think about the level of abstraction of a piece of information such that it can be definitively said to be false? So one example would be something like if I said Obama was born in 2003, that's just completely false. So I call those types of claims like game show trivia level questions, which means that anything you hear on Jeopardy, it's either true or it's false, right? It could be a scientific fact, it could be a historical fact, but it is a fact. And so therefore you could be definitively wrong and then you lose points on the game show or whatever, right? Those are things I think we can confidently label as mis or disinformation. I think where it gets trickier are and this is where some of these distinctions I've been thinking of are between claims that, and this is the first distinction, claims that are actively debunked because we have an overwhelming evidence that the contrary is true. So if I say Obama was born in 2005, there's a tremendous amount of evidence that that's not true. He was born in 1961. If I say the earth is flat, there's a tremendous amount of evidence that the earth is round. That versus claims, and this is where the conspiracy theory thing comes in, claims that could be true. We don't have direct evidence to debunk them, but we don't have enough evidence to say with enough confidence that it's true. And so one example is I saw Carrie Lake talking to Piers Morgan, talking about January 6th, and she was talking about FBI informants in January 6th facilitated the storming of the Capitol. Now, could that be true? I mean, it could be true. Do we have enough evidence that it's true? Not that I've seen. So would claims that could be true but are unsubstantiated, is it fair to label that as misinformation, or should there be a separate category called unsubstantiated?
That's a tricky one.
You can see I'm a huge nerd about this kind of stuff.
Yeah, wow. That is, not to make a corny joke, but that's a rabbit hole to go down. I it's tough because conspiracy theories are often formulated because we have gaps in the information that's available to us. And that's exactly what you're saying is, so the FBI, could have allegedly, led the storming of the Capitol. So could, I guess, aliens dressed as humans, right? We don't have any proof that there weren't aliens dressed as people. I think if we get into the weeds, it becomes incredibly dangerous because then we start questioning everything. And when we question everything, and not that we shouldn't be questioning things, like we should be, we shouldn't just, especially when it comes to what we see online, we shouldn't be trusting everything that we see, but we also need to be able to trust our democratic institutions, our leaders in our local communities. We need to have trust somewhere. And so I don't know about the and that's something I'm going to have to think about is whether we add another category. But you have that with anything, like technically it could be true. No one's come out and provided every single detail of everything that happens, and we're never going to receive every piece of information from what the FBI did that day, but we have to be able to trust our democratic institutions and our governments and our local leaders, because otherwise we have nothing.
Yeah, that is one of the most, I think, tricky, wicked problems and big questions of our time, which brings me to two other rabbit hole questions I have about this too. So I'll just tell you one thing that I teach in some of the workshops I offer through CurePDX is this technique. Some people call it Bayesian epistemology. And the common version of it is like thinking in bets, right? So it's like if a claim can be definitively verified as true or false, instead of thinking this is true or this is not true, the technique is to think in terms either of probability. So I'm 87% sure it's true and 13% sure it's not true. And here's all of the reasons why I'm 87%. Here's what I need to see in order to go from 87 to 90% or down from 87 to 80%. And I actually have people take an issue and then we break it down using this. And my go-to example in the workshops is the Wuhan lab leak hypothesis, which seems to be something that's evolved a lot since 2020, since that initial theory came out. Or the other way is thinking in bets, where it's like, how much of your own money would you bet that this is true? And what I like about thinking in bets is, one, it kind of forces people to have more skin in the game, because if you're wrong, you lose money. And the second thing is the claim that you're working with actually bettable? Could there be a bettable market for this claim? And if there's no betting market for it, that means it's too abstract to be proven true or false. So a claim that's overly abstract is like a trope, right? So it would be like, America's a racist country. That level of abstraction can never qualify as a game show trivia question because it's too abstract. What do you mean by that, right? You can build an argument for why that is, or build an argument to the degree that that's true or not true, but it can't be definitively nailed down in the same way that Obama was born in 1961 or water's made of H2O. So those are some of the techniques I give to people to think about these things.
Interesting. The betting one is interesting. What I'm hearing is that we should promote gambling in our society to address extremism.
That's fake news, Katherine. No.
I'm kidding. No, I think you're right, because there has to be some sort of, either benefit or loss when it comes to promoting these theories or false narratives. Nefarious actors like hostile state actors push these narratives because there is a high probability that people are going to believe it and they are personally benefiting from it. But for the average American, they this is just a very tricky one for me to wrap my head around. Because for many, their lives don't change if they believe a conspiracy theory in many cases. If they believe that, Jewish people are infiltrating the United States or pushing immigration policies for their own nefarious reasons, those sorts of conspiracy theories, there's no personal gain or loss from them for them to believe that. Unless, they start getting affiliated with extremism, and then we see them, go down the hole towards violence. But there is no skin in the game for most of America. And now I have another thing that I have to think about this evening in terms of, how we make there be a cost for these narratives to be pushed, or for people to actually listen or adhere to these narratives. So I'm gonna have to think on that one.
Cool. Yes, I will be too. And I think the other thing I struggle with is this concept of trust. So one of the things I teach in my mediation workshops, especially a specific branch called ideological mediation, where people are at loggerheads about a big issue. I developed this technique when I was mediating conflicts around vaccines in 2021, where ultimately the dispute came down to people don't trust the same sources of information, and they would just get into a huge fight about it. And so the technique I developed is called the one step back. And the one step back is saying, okay, so you disagree, like the tip of the iceberg is we disagree on the facts about vaccines, right? Let's take one step back. How do you think about what to trust and not trust? And let's talk there. So we pivoted from moving from getting fixated on facts or truth to talking about trust and our life experiences and different circumstances that led us to trust one thing or not trust something, and then talk through our reasoning processes around how we develop trust for a certain institution, how we lose trust in a certain institution. And some real powerful kind of moments came out of that conversation. People were bringing up race, culture, history. People were talking about bad personal experiences with the government based on their race, based on their personal history. People talked about their own medical history, and all of that informed how people end up trusting or not trusting something. So I don't know if I have a question. Do you have any just thoughts on this whole theme of trust and not only promoting more trust, but also the right balance of critically thinking through what to trust and what not to trust. One more thing to think, I'll just have to throw this out. These are the things that keep me up at night. So the other one is there ever a good reason to not trust a piece of information, not by looking at the study, but just by the institution that produced it? So my favorite example is tobacco companies in the 50s, literally saying that smoking has no harmful impact on your health and is not connected to lung cancer. Now, I always think, now that we know that, it seems obvious, but is there ever a good reason to just think, hey, because a tobacco company said this, I just should not trust it? Or that's more like what I call an institutional ad hominem. I should probably look at the study first before forming an opinion, or look at other evidence against that. So that was a lot. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I have quite a few thoughts. I really like that tactic when trying to get people to communicate, because when it comes to what media people trust, it varies across the board. Thinking about my personal experience growing up in rural Montana, I think about how, everyone only watched Fox News. People were very distrustful of the governments, feeling like they had sort of been left behind by the elites in Washington, D.C. And for many people, they felt like, Fox was the one trusted news source. And was it because Fox was inaccurately publishing information, or were they just pushing the narratives that already or supported the beliefs of the people watching that already existed? And I think what's happening is it's cyclical, and that people already have some sort of belief, or they might have, an inkling that the US government or some other group shouldn't be trusted, or that they are nefarious. It's my favorite word, if you haven't noticed. Or they have ill intents. And so they often seek media that, supports their existing worldviews. So whether it's the chicken before the egg, I think we're sort of way past that point. But we also need people to be able to trust the media. Unfortunately, we're in a very, very just we have a vast information landscape when it comes to media, because no longer is the media just, the New York Times, the CNN, the Fox News. We have all of these fringe sites that people are also going to for information. And many of those sites are very much have ill intent and are framing narratives in a way that's meant to cause some sort of reaction or emotional reaction or response. And I'm not sure what we do about that. I think we can, there are some things that we can do. Again, local, digital literacy classes being promoted in schools. How do you trust information? How do you, if you see the cigarette company saying that these products are safe, how do you find the study to verify whether that's true? Many Americans don't know how to do that. They see what's popping up on Facebook. They see, some article pops up. Many times they probably aren't even clicking it, but they're seeing it as true. People aren't always educated on how do they fact check. And while, some social media companies are fact checking some stuff, people often don't even believe the fact checks sometimes. So it's coming down to education. Again, communicate with your neighbor, develop relationships in your local communities. But it's a very vast information and media landscape where people can pick and choose whatever information that they want. And there's not really much you can do to stop them. So education.
So this brings me to the second point that I'm curious your thoughts on, and feel free to push back if you don't agree with this. So I would make a strong distinction between false narratives versus fake news, or like disinformation and misinformation, and this distinction to me is informed from a field of study of knowledge management and organization. So it's like a completely orthogonal field that I like to geek out on, but in some of the knowledge management literature, there are two different types of knowledge at two different levels of abstraction. There's concrete knowledge, which is what we call facts, game show trivia questions. And then there's abstract knowledge or narrative level knowledge, right? And so I think of a false narrative as, I would say, is abstract enough where you can't definitively label it to be true or false in the same sense as a concrete piece of information, like a scientific fact or historical fact about when Obama was born or Abraham Lincoln was the 16th president of the United States or something like that. It's more like, so my heuristic is, if you ever have to ask, what do you mean by that? That piece of information cannot be definitively labeled as mis or disinformation, but it can be considered a false narrative. I just call them toxic narratives, inflammatory narratives, toxic narratives, polarizing narratives, inciting narratives. And I emphasize more the detrimental social impact of the narrative more than its truth validity. And that was one way I've navigated the polarization around some of these labels. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think so. The use of false narratives, I think, is not meant to overgeneralize. It's meant to be able to communicate about this issue as a result of hyper politicization. Unfortunately, what we're seeing today is you can't, even with certain audiences, use the phrases mis or disinformation. And unfortunately, if you put out a word, if you say a word and it immediately turns off the conversation, you're not going to get very far. So that's where the use of false narratives really comes from, is there is any need to communicate about this issue. And unfortunately, certain terminology immediately turns off particular audiences. But I think I really like the framing of toxic narratives because I think it's representative of the harm that these narratives do versus just saying, whether it's true or false. So particular harmful narratives or toxic narratives or mis and disinformation targeting particular communities can elicit hostile rhetoric, it can elicit threats, it can elicit violence, and there's a real danger to certain narratives that are being pushed. So I like that framing. I think it's important, but yeah, I think really when it comes down to is we have to label it something. And we have to get talking about it now. We have to be acting now because we have a very high profile election just over a year. So at this point, it matters less about what word we use to describe it. It matters more that we communicate and start finding a solution.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, my concern about this particular point is I feel like sometimes if a claim is too abstract that requires a few levels of interpretation, and that is itself labeled as fake or true or something, that really makes people lose trust really quickly. And so, just as an example, I'd written down. Remember, there was some study. I don't remember all the details. In the wake, I think of the George Floyd protests and riots and stuff. There was something on like 97% of Black Lives Matter groups, like 97% peaceful, but it was also implied like 3% dangerous or harmful, or their violence or something like that. I don't remember all the specifics, but I guess for a lot of people, if you said that either way, if you said, for example, that, oh, therefore it's a fact that Black Lives Matter is a dangerous, violent group because they're violent and dangerous 3% of the time, do you think that would qualify as a piece? Would that even fall into the disinformation stuff? Would you call that a narrative? Or I'm just wondering, what would you label that abstraction of that level of abstraction of a certain claim that Black
I think
Lives Matter is therefore dangerous? Like there might be an underlying set of data with which people are using to draw a conclusion, and the data might be accurate, but the conclusion might be different. And then the interpretation of the data is then labeled true or not true.
Sure. So for that particular example, the use of the statistic, I would argue, is not mis or disinformation. Just at the baseline, the use 97%, 3%, that's very basic data. That's assuming it sounds that it's factually accurate, right? The problem is, and I am hesitant to try and label it as either, but the nefarious purposes surrounding it. So using data to argue a particular point. So what we often see are extremists taking factual information and twisting it or portraying it in a certain way that's meant to either recruit or push a particular belief. We often see this with more of the white supremacist groups using incidents of violence that have targeted people who are white, or where the victim has been white, to push particular narratives. So it's not that that person wasn't a victim. It's not that crime didn't occur, but they are using particular pieces of data to support their ideological beliefs. And I think that comes back to what you've previously mentioned, and I feel like you may have already solved this, or the toxic narratives. Using that data in a way that is meant to push a particular belief, even if it isn't fully accurate. The use of the statistic, the stat that is accurate may help them, support an existing ideological worldview. So I'm hesitant to put that into any category, and I would actually put that in your bucket that you created of toxic narratives.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And which gets me just to the last point, which is in my experience monitoring these online chats and also like mediating really polarized discussions, a lot of the topics that people really get heated around actually are not factual topics. They're values, they're moral ideals, they're different ideas about the nature of reality. So one discussion, a few stood out to me. One was It turns out that I believe in original sin and you believe in a blank slate. We're just never going to agree. Like that's just a philosophical disagreement. And all of the contested topics like abortion, immigration, and the trans questions, trans issues, there's a lot of philosophical, this unresolved questions and I don't think they can actually ever be nailed down decisively through studies or data or science or social science. I think they're just different abstractions about reality that can be really, really heated because they go straight to people's identity, right, on either side of the issue. And then the whole conversation spirals out of control. So the framework that I created with my colleague Jack, that we had an article published on GNet, was called meta ideological awareness. And it's kind of a framework to think about almost like the right attitude or mindset or disposition that we think it would be good for people to have generally when approaching any kind of narrative level claim. So not factual claim, because there are skill sets you can build like media literacy and critical thinking for factual claims, but for narrative level claims, just kind of a deeper awareness just to be like, oh, that's a narrative, right? And that the interpretations are contested and it can be more like an opinion even. But it's not a cold hard fact, and I shouldn't treat it as if it is. So that's kind of and we can then have a conversation about different interpretations.
Yeah, I think that's completely accurate. I, especially when it comes to certain beliefs like abortion or LGBTQ plus rights, a lot of people might be against it because it comes down to, the core of their beliefs, be it's against their religion. And, no matter what you say, no matter what fact you give, they're not going to ever, they might not ever support it because it's a core part of their identity. The difference is that when it changes from a core part of their identity to wanting to harm others or take away the rights of others based on this belief. And I think that's where things get trickier. And I'd actually be interested, based on, this topic, your thoughts when it comes to disengagement or de-radicalization, because if your extremist beliefs, for example, if you are a radical anti-abortionist and you engage in violence targeting a Planned Parenthood facility, could you ever actually de-radicalize that person to the fullest extent if their anti-abortion beliefs are part of their core part of their ideology or their belief system, if it's truly part of their religion? How would you ever, or are you able to de-radicalize? So I'm turning it back to you.
Yeah. So my perspective on this is I think it ultimately comes down to not having the person engage in violent action. And I think that you can hold that belief really core. I have a lot of friends who are like very deep in the kind of evangelical conservative communities who feel very, very, very passionately about this. And they would never act violently against another person. They would never even yell at another person about it, but they feel really, really, really strongly about it. Right. So I hope that that's kind of like the right yeah, kind of attitude to be cultivating. And we always say on Cure PDX, you can hold the beliefs with all the passion and conviction and advocate for them and go to the ballot box and protest, for them. Just don't act violently or hostilely against the opposing group, as ultimately I think what it comes down to. That's just me. And I think it gets trickier when you look at the relationship between certain beliefs and the propensity for violent action. But I always say, regardless of where we land on that question, I think that this kind of initial awareness as a buffer can create enough of an opening, right? Enough of a pause between stimulus and response, such that a new path can be opened away from violence. And so that's my justification for my meta ideological position. Regardless of what people's ultimate beliefs are, it's a good place to start the work.
I couldn't agree more with you. It's that shift from belief to violence that is so critical to countering this threat.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And just one more thing I want to just touch on really quickly was I started thinking about little, and I don't really like the word nudge because it associates with this whole controversial theory called like this book called Nudge and, this libertarian paternalism. But if we were going to use that term nudge, I think about Like, what are some little micro nudges, so to speak, that social media platforms could adopt or use for toxic narratives and narrative level claims, where straight up banning them or censoring them might have some bad ripple effects, right? Some bad ramifications. But if the right nudges are in place around them, that could hopefully spur a little bit more awareness or critical thinking about the narrative. And so I was experimenting with Chat GPT to see if AI could scale this in any way. And the two things I think that are really interesting is that I'd like to see tested, and I'm curious your perspective on this. One is to list or have an option for people to click on for any narrative level claim or even factual claim, but more specifically for a narrative level claim, what are the underlying premises and assumptions in order for this to be true that are not stated explicitly? So you think immediately about all of the underlying factors that are insinuated, but they're not actually stated directly. And that gets people to think about, why do I believe this, or what are the underlying things? The second one I'm very interested in is a actual visual diagram can appear next to a claim that shows all of the information or data or arguments that are not included in that conclusion that counteract it. And the example I always give is, like any kind of book you read that where there's like a title of the book, like let's say like different dietary fads or dietary trends, like paleo diet is the best diet ever, right? And the doctor who wrote the paleo diet book has all of the facts and evidence that paleo diet is the best diet. So immediately my thought is whenever I read a book like that, what is everything the guy left out of his thesis? And if there was a way to visually depict what is left out of a certain argument, claim, perspective, ideology, etc., that could kind of open people's minds to thinking more about, just what they're leaving out what information they're leaving out that builds their narrative that they might want to look into to get a bigger picture.
I like the positive thinking around this, but I'm hesitant to think that adding in more information to what people are seeing, especially on social media, it's going to be read. And I don't want to, I sound like a pessimist, but in the world of, for TikTok, we have reels where we're watching, 5 to 10 clips and then we move on to the next. It's a little difficult to get someone to take that extra step. And even if it's a graphic, are they going to look at it all the way through? I think one of the things that can be done by social media companies, and unfortunately we seem to be on a backslide where many social media companies are instead rolling back their policies related to extremism and disinformation, is the amplification of extremist content and other potentially dangerous content based on the algorithms that they're using. So there have been a number of studies that have been done that show what sort of content YouTube is promoting to people online. And these tests have, set the parameters for the account to an individual who is in their teens. And they might watch one video, it might be on the right or the left, and 8 hours later, they haven't clicked a thing, but the loop has just driven them to more and more extreme content. And you're never gonna, social media companies are always going to be focused on profitability. But at the end of the day, we can take steps to ensure that they don't just fall upon this content because Instagram or YouTube wanted to keep them on longer. And so at the end of the day, I think ensuring that people don't have easy access to this content and that it's not promoted to them, especially when it comes to youth, especially when it comes to teens, is key. Because in the world of short form video, they're going to be looking at tons and tons of content each day. I can't discount it. Instagram reels are often what put me to sleep because for me, at least, my algorithm is a lot of puppies and farm animals. But for many, it's becoming incredibly extreme. And what we can at least do is make sure that we are not providing or, essentially handing it over to people who didn't ask for it.
That makes complete sense. My Instagram reel is baby goats and MMA fights.
Yeah. Do they ever cross where the baby goats are involved in MMA fights? Because that would be pretty cool.
There are some reels of baby goats ramming other little kids in the face. That's probably the closest thing. No,
Oh,
what you said makes complete sense. And I guess, yeah, the scalability is really difficult with how these platforms are designed and people's attention span being hijacked. And I think it'd have to be a more local endeavor. These are also things I teach in some of my workshops. So yeah, I think it has to be a local and working, yeah, in person with people to develop these kind of thinking habits. But it's very tricky.
it's very tricky, and my suggestion regarding social media is just one of many things that would need to occur to adequately address this problem. Because you had mentioned, censorship or removing people from platforms. Well, at the end of the day, what that often does, it helps bolster existing narratives claiming that social media companies are attacking particular people with particular beliefs. And then those people will often go to platforms that have minimal moderation policies, and you haven't necessarily taken their microphone away. You might have moved it, you might have lessened the intensity, but it's still there. So there are a lot of solutions that all need to be working together. But again, local, local, local.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Katherine, thank you so much for kind of humoring me and going down this rabbit hole about rabbit holes. That was really fun. Did you anything else you want to say or yeah, anything you want to share before we wrap up?
I don't I don't think so. I am just very grateful that you asked me to come on. I think that, building relationships, at the end of the day, we all have the same mission. So just every opportunity that we get to, talk about these issues, especially at the local level, I just feel very grateful for. And also want to thank you for the work that you do, because I think it's incredibly important and arguably the most difficult, because you are on the ground working with people and really addressing this in a way that's face to face. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, the appreciation is certainly mutual and yeah, look forward to talking with you and working with you more.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks for joining us today. If you want to stay up to date with the Cure PDX project, go to cure-pdx.org. Again, that's cure-pdx.org. And if you want to talk more about trainings, dialogues, events, or anything related to the Cure PDX project, email us at curepdx@cbg.org. Again, that's curepdx@cbg.org. We look forward to hearing from you.